The sky was burning. Adrian Carter crouched behind the crumbling remains of a collapsed overpass, her rifle cradled against her chest. The air stank of scorched metal and ozone, a choking mixture of human civilization turned to ash. Across the broken highway, alien patrols moved in tight formations, their sleek black armor reflecting the eerie glow of the fires that had consumed Los Angeles. She wiped the sweat and grime from her face, her muscles taut with exhaustion, but she forced herself to stay focused. The Zelvari had underestimated humanity's resilience, but that didn't mean victory was coming. The world had already fallen. America had been crushed under the weight of orbital bombardments and overwhelming ground invasions. They thought they had won. Adrienne's earpiece crackled to life. "I count 6 hostiles, standard patrol pattern," Riley Thompson whispered. "They're getting lazy." From her vantage point in a nearby building, Riley had the best eyes on the field. Her voice, calm and professional, carried none of the exhaustion Adrian knew she must be feeling. 3 weeks of constant movement, hiding in the ruins, striking only when necessary, had left their resistance cells stretched thin. Supplies were dwindling. Hope was worse. Adrian adjusted her grip on her rifle. "We take them quietly. No risks." A soft chuckle came through the earpiece. "Wasn't planning on getting caught." A few blocks away, Helena Vasquez worked in a makeshift lab carved out of an abandoned subway station. An engineer before the war, she had spent the last few months salvaging alien tech, trying to find a way to level the battlefield. Adrian had never been one for science, but she knew the importance of Helena's work. Without her, they were just humans with outdated weapons fighting against an enemy centuries ahead. She gave the signal. Riley's first shot was soundless, a precise execution. One alien collapsed, its tall, sinewy form twitching before going still. Adrian moved swiftly, her knife sliding under the armor of a second soldier, severing whatever passed for arteries in their anatomy. The Zelvari gurgled, their mouths, too wide, too full of serrated teeth, parting in a silent snarl before death took them. The last of the patrol barely had time to react before Riley's bullet pierced its skull. Silence. Adrian exhaled and signaled her team to move. They made their way through the ruins, past hollowed-out cars and shattered storefronts. The city had once been alive, filled with people chasing dreams, families laughing under neon lights. Now it was a graveyard. Zelvari banners hung from crumbling skyscrapers, their alien symbols a declaration of ownership. As they slipped through a broken service tunnel, Adrian felt the weight of failure settle in her chest. Humanity had fought back with everything they had, but it hadn't been enough. The military had been decimated, the government collapsed, and the cities reduced to hunting grounds for the enemy. Those who hadn't died in the initial invasion were now either in hiding or rounded up into labor camps. And yet, even in the face of annihilation, they fought. The underground hideout was dimly lit, power rationed to keep their location hidden. A handful of survivors worked quietly, stripping weapons, cooking meager rations, tending to the wounded. Adrian gave them a nod before heading straight to Helena's workstation. The engineer was hunched over an alien power core, the faint blue glow casting sharp shadows on her face. She didn't look up. "Tell me you brought something useful." Adrian pulled a small, hexagonal device from her belt and dropped it on the table. "One of their comm relays. Thought you might like it." Helena snatched it up, eyes alight with something close to excitement. "If I can crack their encryption, we'll have access to their troop movements, supply lines, everything." Riley leaned against the wall, wiping down her rifle. "If you can crack it." "I will." Helena's voice was steel. "Just give me time." Adrian turned to Riley. "Patrols are getting sloppy. Either they think we're dead, or they're stretched thin." Riley's expression darkened. "Or they've already got what they came for." That was the thought none of them wanted to voice. The Zelvari weren't just conquerors. They didn't just take planets, they consumed them. Resources, bodies, knowledge. Everything humanity had built was being fed into their war machine. Adrian pulled up a tattered map and laid it on the table. "If they're overconfident, we use that. Hit their supply caches, take out their officers, bleed them." Helena snorted. Sounds like a good way to get killed. Better than waiting to be hunted. The room was silent. The fight had already cost them so much. Friends, families, the world they knew. But surrender was not an option. A distant explosion rumbled through the ground, shaking dust from the ceiling. Seconds later, the radio sputtered to life. Panicked voice. They found us. North Tunnel, heavy fire. The transmission cut off. Adrian was already moving. Riley was right behind her, rifle in hand, while Helena grabbed a sidearm, muttering curses under her breath. The survivors in the hideout scattered, weapons drawn, ready to defend the last sanctuary they had. The North Tunnel was a choke point, narrow and filled with debris. As Adrian rounded the corner, she saw the first wave of Zelvari advancing, their weapons glowing with that unnatural blue energy. Bodies of human fighters lay scattered in their wake. Her grip tightened on her rifle. The aliens thought they had won. She raised her weapon. Time to remind them who they were dealing with. Smoke and blood hung thick in the tunnels. The ambush had left 6 more of their people dead, their bodies dragged back to the central chamber for whatever crude burial they could manage. Helena knelt beside the radio console, fingers stained with oil and soot as she struggled to bring the battered equipment back online. Sparks spat from the damaged wiring, the machine groaning in protest. "We lost contact with the eastern cell," she muttered, frustration bleeding into exhaustion. Adrian paced behind her, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "That was our best fallback point. If they got hit, that means we're next." Riley sat on an overturned crate, cleaning her rifle with practiced ease, though the sharpness in her eyes betrayed her tension. "Then we hit first." No one disagreed. The Zelvari had been pushing harder, their forces spreading through the city with renewed aggression. What had once been routine patrols had turned into sweeping purges, hunting down resistance cells with ruthless efficiency. If they were going to survive, they needed to change the rules of engagement. Helena yanked out a melted circuit board and sighed. "This thing's useless." She turned to Adrian. "But that comm relay you brought in? I cracked it. That got their attention." Adrian stopped pacing. Riley put down her rifle. The weight of the moment pressed into the small space between them. Helena grabbed a handheld display and brought up a series of alien symbols, quickly translating them into English. "I've been running their encrypted transmissions through a pattern breaker. Turns out, they aren't just talking about troop movements." She pointed at a section of scrolling text. "They've been consolidating supplies at the old Federal Armory downtown. Weapons, fuel, medical gear, everything we're running out of." Adrian leaned in, scanning the data. The armory had been one of the first places hit during the invasion, but if the Zelvari had repurposed it as a storage depot, that meant it was lightly guarded. They weren't expecting a fight. She exhaled slowly. "How sure are you about this?" Helena smirked. "Certain enough to bet my life on it." Riley tightened the strap on her vest. "Then it's settled. We gear up and take it." The plan was simple. A 3-woman team in and out before the Zelvari knew what hit them. They couldn't afford a prolonged battle, not yet. This was about taking what they needed and making the aliens hurt while doing it. Nightfall brought the cover they needed. The city was a husk of its former self, the skyline broken, the streets littered with the remnants of a lost war. The Zelvari, for all their technological superiority, didn't understand the terrain the way humans did. They patrolled the open streets, relied on drones and scanners, but they didn't search the ruins like those who had lived there. That was their first mistake. Riley led the way through a collapsed subway tunnel, moving like a shadow between the wreckage. Helena followed, carrying a modified Zelvari disruptor she had rewired to interfere with their sensor arrays. Adrian took the rear, keeping her rifle ready. They reached the armory without incident. A lone alien guard stood at the entrance, scanning the darkness with those lidless, reptilian eyes. The sentry never heard Riley's approach, never saw the knife until it was buried deep in the base of its skull. She lowered the body silently, wiping her blade against its armor. Inside, the depot was stacked with crates marked in alien script. Helena pulled out a handheld scanner, checking the contents. "Jackpot," she whispered. Plasma cells, combat stims, and she pried open a heavy metal case, revealing rows of sleek, alien rifles. Oh, these will do nicely. Adrian grabbed one and tested its weight. Lighter than a human rifle, but the energy core hummed with an unnatural power. She handed another to Riley, who checked the sights with an approving nod. Then Helena's scanner beeped. A security override. They weren't alone. The moment the door slid open, Adrian fired first, the plasma round punching through the first Zelvari's armor. Riley dropped the second before it could react. But the third got a shot off. A pulse of blue energy slammed into Helena's shoulder, sending her sprawling. Adrian spun, unloading a burst into the attacker before rushing to Helena's side. The engineer gritted her teeth, pressing a hand to the wound. "I'm fine," she gasped. "Get what we came for." Riley slung one of the alien rifles over her shoulder and grabbed a pack of power cells. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they send reinforcements." Adrian pulled Helena to her feet, ignoring her protests. "Then we move now." They tore through the depot, shoving as much as they could carry into their packs before slipping back into the tunnels. The sound of heavy boots and garbled alien commands echoed behind them. By the time the Zelvari reached the depot, the humans were gone. Back at the hideout, the stolen supplies were met with a mixture of relief and awe. For the first time in weeks, they weren't scraping the bottom of their reserves. The weapons alone changed everything. They weren't just scavengers anymore. Helena sat against the wall, her wound patched up, cradling one of the rifles in her lap. "I ran another scan before we left," she said. "That wasn't their only depot." Adrian met her gaze. "Where's the next one?" Helena smirked. "A lot closer than you'd think." Riley cracked her knuckles, the fire in her eyes unmistakable. "Then let's keep taking." The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And for the first time since the invasion, Adrian felt something she hadn't dared to before. Hope. The Zelvari were learning. The last raid had gone too smoothly, the depot too lightly guarded, almost as if they had wanted it to be taken. Adrian had spent years operating behind enemy lines, and she knew when something felt wrong. Helena's intel was solid, but the ease of their success gnawed at her. The Zelvari weren't careless. They adapted just as humanity did. And now they were reacting. She tightened the straps on her gear, adjusting the alien rifle slung across her back. Around her, the underground hideout buzzed with new energy. People who had once been little more than survivors were now soldiers, armed with Zelvari weapons, moving with renewed purpose. The resistance had grown. Small but effective. It wasn't enough to win a war, not yet, but it was enough to strike back. Helena sat cross-legged on the floor, poring over stolen schematics on a dimly lit tablet. Riley paced nearby, tension radiating from every controlled movement. Neither of them had spoken much since the last mission. There was a shift in the air, an unspoken understanding that whatever they did next would determine whether they remained the hunters or became the hunted. Helena finally broke the silence. "Their main command post is set up inside the old courthouse." She gestured to a map, tracing the building's perimeter. "Reinforced walls, energy barriers, full surveillance net. We hit that, and we ripped the eyes right out of their heads." Adrian studied the layout. The Zelvari had turned the courthouse into the core of their occupation, a nerve center coordinating every patrol, every supply line, every counterattack. Disrupting it wouldn't just slow them down, it would cripple them. But the defenses were thick. Riley exhaled sharply. "This isn't a depot. This is a fortress." Helena smirked, tapping the display. "That's why we don't go through the front door." She turned the tablet, revealing a network of underground tunnels beneath the city. Sewer lines, maintenance shafts, old service tunnels. The Zelvari don't use them. They think anything underground is beneath their notice. Adrian felt the spark of something dangerous flicker in her chest. "How long until they do notice?" "Long enough," Helena said. Riley rolled her shoulders, cracking her neck. "Then we don't waste time." They moved at dusk, slipping into the tunnels before the Zelvari's night patrols could sweep the streets. The damp air reeked of stagnant water and decay, but it was better than getting picked off by sentry drones. Adrian led the way, keeping a steady pace through the darkness, Helena close behind, recalibrating the stolen disruptor every few minutes to keep them off the enemy's scanners. Hours passed in near silence, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery above and the rhythmic drip of water. Every so often, Riley scouted ahead, moving like a ghost through the passageways, signaling when the path was clear. When they reached the courthouse's lowest level, they paused. Helena crouched near a rusted maintenance panel, prying it open with practiced ease. "Energy grid runs through here," she murmured, fingers dancing over the exposed circuitry. "Give me 60 seconds. Adrian knelt beside her, watching the way her hands moved, fast and efficient despite the lingering stiffness from her wound. The fight hadn't broken her. If anything, it had sharpened her. Lights flickered above as Helena completed the bypass. Their sensors just went blind. "We're in." They emerged into a service corridor, the walls lined with conduits pulsing with alien energy. Footsteps echoed in the distance, Zelvari patrols, moving in precise formations. The enemy was here in force, but they weren't expecting an attack from below. Riley took point, signaling for silence as she crept forward. A lone Zelvari technician stood at a terminal, oblivious to the 3 humans slipping behind him. Adrian moved first, wrapping an arm around its elongated neck, knife pressing into the soft flesh beneath its mandibles. A quick twist, and the body slumped to the floor without a sound. Helena immediately went to work on the terminal, bypassing layers of security. "I can kill their comms," she whispered. "They won't be able to coordinate reinforcements." Adrian nodded. "Do it." The moment Helena executed the override, alarms blared through the facility. The Zelvari might not have been able to call for backup, but they knew something was wrong. Riley grabbed one of the stolen rifles. "We move fast." They sprinted through the corridors, taking cover as the first wave of guards rushed in. Plasma fire lit up the narrow passage, forcing them to duck behind storage containers. Riley dropped the first attacker with a clean headshot. Adrian fired in controlled bursts, aiming for weak points in the armor. The air was thick with the scent of scorched flesh and burning metal. Helena shouted from behind them, "We need to reach the main console, 3rd floor." Adrian motioned for Riley to push forward. They fought through the halls, moving as one, every shot precise, every step calculated. The Zelvari hadn't been prepared for an assault inside their own stronghold. By the time the humans reached the command center, the remaining guards had begun to fall back, regrouping for a final stand. Helena rushed to the main terminal, bypassing the last layer of encryption. "Give me a minute." Adrian took position at the door, reloading her rifle. Riley knelt beside her, breath steady, ready for the next wave. The enemy was coming. Helena cursed under her breath. "Their entire security net is linked to an external server. I can't just shut it down. I have to fry it from the source." Adrian didn't hesitate. "Where?" Helena pointed to a reinforced data core embedded in the wall. "There." Riley was already moving, planting explosives along the core's interface. "This'll do it." The sound of heavy boots echoed closer. The Zelvari weren't going to let them leave alive. Adrian glanced at Riley. "On my mark." Riley nodded, finger hovering over the detonator. The door burst open. Adrian fired first, dropping the lead soldier. Riley took the next. Helena ducked behind the console, shielding herself from the barrage of return fire. The room shook with the force of combat, energy rounds scorching the walls. Adrian counted the seconds. 5, 4, 3. Now! Riley hit the trigger. The explosion tore through the command center, the shockwave sending debris flying. The lights flickered, then died. The entire system crashed in an instant. The Zelvari security grid, their surveillance, their ability to track human movement, it was all gone. The surviving guards hesitated, disoriented. Adrian didn't. She fired into the confusion, cutting them down before they could recover. The silence that followed was deafening. Helena coughed, waving away the dust. "We did it." Riley exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to a fresh gash on her arm. Yeah. Adrian glanced at the ruined console, at the bodies on the floor, at the city beyond the shattered window. The courthouse had fallen. The Zelvari had lost their control over the city's systems. For the first time since the invasion, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were winning. Smoke curled through the shattered remains of the courthouse, the acrid scent of burning circuitry and charred flesh clinging to the air. Adrian scanned the ruined control room, listening for any movement beneath the settling debris. Nothing. The Zelvari had been routed, their command structure obliterated. The resistance had struck a wound deep into the enemy's core, one they couldn't ignore. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Helena pried herself off the ground, coughing as she swiped dust from her face. Blood trickled from a cut above her brow, but her eyes were clear, sharp with the weight of what they had done. The Zelvari relied on precision, on coordination. With their security grid destroyed, their command shattered, they had lost that edge. And that meant they were vulnerable. Riley adjusted the sling on her injured arm, rolling her shoulder as she stepped past the wreckage. We just kicked a hornet's nest. Adrian nodded, glancing out over the city. Fires burned in the distance, but it wasn't the Zelvari setting them. Human forces had taken advantage of the blackout, striking at occupation zones, reclaiming lost ground. The tide had turned. The aliens thought they had won. They had occupied Earth. They had controlled its cities. They had crushed its armies. But now, for the first time, they weren't facing scattered survivors. They were facing something else entirely. Helena patched into the remaining systems, sifting through broken data streams, pulling what little she could from the ruins of the Zelvari network. They're falling back. High Command is ordering a retreat to the outer sectors. Riley smirked. They're running. No, Adrian said. They're regrouping. A species as advanced as the Zelvari wouldn't just abandon a planet they had fought so hard to control. They had to be planning something. Adrian tapped into her comms, reaching out to scattered cells across the region. The reports were the same. The Zelvari were withdrawing from city centers, leaving behind only automated sentries and scattered patrols. They weren't fighting, they were waiting. Helena worked quickly, rerouting power to a half-functioning console, her fingers moving with urgency. Got something. Lines of alien script scrolled across the display, shifting under her decryption protocols. Adrian leaned in, eyes narrowing as the translation finalized. A single directive repeated over and over. Orbital cleansing protocol initiated. The realization hit like a gut punch. Adrian straightened, her breath steady despite the storm churning inside her mind. The Zelvari weren't retreating. They were preparing to burn the planet. If they couldn't control Earth, they would erase it. Helena's fingers hovered over the interface. This is a full-scale purge. They're pulling everything back into orbit, and then they turn the surface into ash. Riley finished. Her jaw tightened, but her voice held no fear, only determination. Adrian exhaled, already calculating their next move. They had dealt a blow to the occupation, but now the war had escalated beyond the ground. The fight wasn't for control anymore. It was for survival. Helena tapped into the last remaining link in the alien network, pushing past the damage from the attack. There's a fleet gathering in high orbit. We're talking planetary bombardment scale. She glanced up. We can't stop this from the ground. Riley adjusted her grip on her rifle. Then we go up. Adrian didn't hesitate. The Resistance had stolen dropships before, repurposed alien technology for their own use. It was a risk, but the only alternative was waiting for death. Helena, find us a ship. Riley, we need weapons enough to fight our way aboard. Riley grinned, the fire in her eyes burning bright. Already on it. They moved fast, slipping through the chaos of the city. The Zelvari were still reeling, their forces caught between retreat and reorganization. Resistance fighters struck at supply lines, scavenging what they could before the real fight began. Adrienne's unit moved with purpose, cutting through abandoned sectors, heading for the last operational alien outpost. If the Zelvari were evacuating, they'd need transports. And the humans needed one of their own. The base was lightly guarded, too lightly. The Zelvari stationed here weren't fighters. They were engineers, technicians, personnel assigned to logistics, not battle. They didn't expect an assault, not with the orbital strike looming. That mistake cost them everything. Adrian's team moved with ruthless precision, clearing the compound in minutes. Helena secured the launch bay while Riley prepped the dropship. The stolen vessel was sleek, built for speed, its controls foreign but decipherable. The moment the engines roared to life, Adrian knew there was no turning back. As the ship lifted off, the city shrank beneath them, the fires and ruins blending into the darkness of night. Above, the Zelvari fleet loomed, a vast armada preparing to deliver extinction. Adrian gripped the edge of her seat, her gaze locked on the flagship at the center of it all. That was their target. The dropship breached the fleet's outer defenses before the Zelvari could react. Helena navigated through encrypted clearance codes, slipping past detection grids. By the time the enemy realized what was happening, it was too late. The ship latched onto the flagship's docking bay, and the team moved swiftly, breaching the corridors with stolen rifles. The Zelvari inside weren't prepared for a boarding action. They fell in seconds. Adrian led the charge, cutting through resistance with brutal efficiency. Riley kept their flank clear, every shot precise, every movement lethal. Helena guided them through the vessel's labyrinthine structure, leading them toward the command center. The final corridor was heavily guarded. The Zelvari stationed here weren't engineers or technicians. They were warriors. They fought with the desperation of a species that knew it was facing something it didn't understand. Humanity had been broken, beaten, subjugated. And yet, here they were, standing in the heart of the enemy's war machine, carving their way to victory. Adrian emptied her magazine, swapping for a fresh power cell as she pushed forward. Riley covered her, taking down a charging Zelvari before it could reach them. Helena worked the controls, bypassing the final lock as the last defender fell. The command center doors slid open. Inside, the Zelvari officers turned in shock. Adrian raised her rifle, shut it down. The lead officer bared its fangs, reaching for the console. Riley fired first, the shot taking it clean through the skull. The others barely had time to react before they fell in a storm of bullets and plasma fire. Helena rushed to the main terminal, fingers flying across the controls. "I can override their system. Stop the bombardment." Adrian stood guard, watching as the fleet outside prepared for destruction. Seconds stretched into eternity as Helena fought against the alien code. Then suddenly the screens flickered. The weapons went silent. The fleet's targeting systems collapsed. It was over. Adrian exhaled, lowering her weapon. Riley leaned against the wall, breath steady, eyes still sharp despite the exhaustion. Helena slumped back, letting out a shaky laugh. The Zelvari had thought they had won. They had thought humanity was finished. But they hadn't understood what they were up against. Humanity didn't surrender. Humanity didn't break. And when the time came, humanity stood up and chose violence.